Hello, my name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post, but I also happen to be a political scientist that studies Russian foreign policy. So right now, we're in a very complicated situation, and unfortunately, it appears that we might be making big mistakes with Russia, which we will be regretting for many years to come. So to start with, recently the White House has said, via its various representatives, including the Secretary of Defense, that it does not believe that the 1991 borders of Ukraine being retaken, being liberated, is realistic. More than that, it is said that NATO membership just doesn't make sense. Now, when we think about this, this is a huge reversal from US foreign policy for the past 3 years. But more alarming than that is that this is exactly what Russia wants. Russia is famous for going into negotiations and doing a good job at getting what they want out of other countries through threats, through stomping their feet, through complaints, by doing everything possible to say that there's red lines and they refuse to even begin the negotiations unless they get what they want. And in this case, it seems that's how it started. So just to begin negotiations, they've probably put out red lines, including that Ukraine would never join NATO, they'd be demilitarized, and that the 1991 borders be forgotten, and the Ukraine give up on trying to liberate the territories currently under Russian occupation. The obvious mistake here is that Russia is leveraging very little to get a lot. Russia is not in condition to be able to continue fighting a war against Ukraine. And there's three axes upon which that lies. The military axis, I think, which is the one that we most often talked about, is very clear. Russia has lost 750,000 soldiers, either injured or killed, in Ukraine. Continuing the fight is wholly unrealistic. In fact, the Russian military has not been so weak as it is today since immediately after World War II. But more to that point, every day we see more videos coming out of Russian soldiers who are with canes or even crawling being sent to fight on the front lines against Ukraine. Now, just imagine this. Russian soldiers who can't even walk and are crawling are being sent to storm Ukrainian positions. That's the state of the Russian military. That doesn't sound like a military that's in a position to leverage strength and say that they will not start negotiations unless they get something that they want. That sounds like a military that'd be happy to get out of the current situation it's in. But let's look at the economic situation. Well, one, the war in Ukraine has cost the Russian economy a lot. Aside from the fact that it's about 35 or 40% of the country's budget that goes to the war in Ukraine, something that's wiped out money that would normally go for social issues and for local communities, that's money that's just disappearing. Building weaponry that goes and gets destroyed. Paying bonuses to soldiers who then go and get killed. It is not a great investment for Russia. Russia is losing money on this in a serious way. But more important than that is that recently it's come out that the Russian banks have been forced to loan incredible sums of money to the Russian military so they can continue this war. Those banks, I'm pretty sure, they will not be seeing that money again, which has left large holes on their balance sheets. But more than that, we have a couple other factors at play. One is that Russia has a 27% inflation rate. Could actually be a bit higher. The good news is that the Russian central bank is trying to combat that, but is being combated itself by the Russian parliament and by the Kremlin, who don't want to increase interest rates because they think that it'll make them unpopular. The consequence of not increasing interest rates? Inflation just gets worse and worse. But even more important than that is the fact that the government had the brilliant idea for years to subsidize massive amounts of mortgages using private banks as the entities to give them out. And what's the problem with that? Well, it was great when everybody was taking out loans and real estate prices were climbing. But today, real estate prices started to collapse in Russia. In fact, some of the biggest construction companies in Russia have begun to sell off properties and have said that they're going to struggle to be able to pay back the money they've taken out from banks. Once they start to collapse, we're going to see a trickle-down effect across the economy. For the common Russian, who's taken out a house that's lost value, and it could be a lot, let's say a third of the value, they're going to be underwater. There's not going to be a way to pay back those mortgages. And as we saw in 2008 during the US house marketing crisis, we might see a very similar thing happen. Russians just don't pay back the money. Those banks then are left with more holes. And at some point, it becomes just too difficult to keep up. And they'll need more government subsidization to stay afloat. That's where it gets better. If the banks are intervened by the government, what happens? It means more inflation. It means more money to be printed, more fake money to fill in those holes, fill in those gaps. And no matter what happens next, the Russian government is put in a position of printing more and more money. So when a country is facing a situation like this, it by no means has the ability to dictate what is going to happen next. Instead, if the US were to just further enforce sanctions, as the Trump administration began, we saw that when it took office, the Indians as well as the Chinese said that they would no longer be buying Russian oil due to fear of secondary sanctions. That's huge. Keep in mind, the oil and gas industry is 40 to 50% of the Russian budget. So if we go after that strong and we make sure that Russia can't sell its oil, and we really do go after the ghost fleets, we could have a dramatic effect on the Russian economy. And by doing that, we could really set them back. And just as somebody who's interested in what's good for the US, that's something we should all want. Because this is not something that someone in the White House should do out of compassion for Ukraine. This is something because it's good for the US. If we can further degrade the Russian military, degrade Russia as a power, this has a lot of positive effects. Keep in mind, Russia isn't just a Ukraine problem. Russia is a close ally of North Korea, as we've seen. It's a close ally of Iran. Russia works with Hezbollah, and Russia works with Hamas. These institutions, or these organizations, also work with other terrorists, and they also work with drug cartels and other nefarious actors that operate against the interests of the United States. So if we want to actually stick at them, and we want to actually combat our enemies, going after Russia, the kingpin of all this international operation of evil, is probably the best thing that could happen to us. So why possibly, knowing all of these things, will we decide now to cut Russia a pass and give them what they want? In my eyes, it makes no sense whatsoever that he who started the war would be given conditions that he desires or demands, knowing that one, he has no ability to fight against the conditions that we set, but two, it sets a very bad precedent. Why is it that it's not Ukraine setting the rules of what is acceptable, but rather the aggressor who's setting the rules? It's totally nonsensical. But worse than that, I think looking ahead, we see that the Russians are going to milk this for as much as they can. And one of the things that I'm sure they will go for first is to remove sanctions, something that will give Russia the ability to rebound and rebuild its military. So, where's the silver lining? What's good? One thing that does give me a lot of hope, and I think could be what works out well for us in the end, are the wild cards. There's two in particular that I have seen. One is the whole recent argument about rare earth metals. And it is true, the United States, the White House, is interested in about $500 billion worth of rare earth metals. And why that's interesting? Well, they're not just located in Ukraine. They're located where the front is right now in the war. And they're located in occupied territories. At least the vast majority of them are. So if the US really wants to ever get to see that money, the best thing it can do is give Ukraine the weapons necessary to repel the Russians. Give Ukrainians the weapons they need in order to keep the Russian military unbalanced, so it's not able to advance and not able to take the lives of Ukrainian soldiers by striking them from long distances. The second aspect of this, which is a wild card, is what the Europeans will do. Though at present it seems quite unlikely, it is possible that the Europeans coalesce and decide to get serious in backing Ukraine in exchange for something from the United States, whatever that happens to be. But if there is not security guarantees coming from the Europeans, and there's not weaponry coming from the Europeans, things look very bleak for Ukraine. So if we want to be serious about what the future holds, it's difficult to say, but it's very clear to say that those who are currently working on the Russia portfolio for the United States, such as billionaire Witkoff, who flew to Moscow to negotiate the release of American prisoner Fogel, it's a bad sign. Witkoff is a real estate developer. He's a billionaire. He is not a political scientist. He does not understand Russia. He thinks they're just like us. And that's the first mistake when trying to understand the Russians. They're not just like us. They think that when we show kindness, or that we show hesitation, or that we show fear, that it shows that we are weak and we deserve to be taken advantage of. We deserve to be abused. And I think this is something that we will regret for generations to come. So, in these current situation, as complex as it is, it's very clear that we still have the opportunity for change. We still have the opportunity to do what is right. And doing what is right means telling Putin that he has to leave. And if he doesn't, that Ukraine will be fully armed. With modern weaponry, with modern technologies, Ukraine could do a significant amount to degrade the Russian military further. And by doing that, we're not just helping Ukraine. This helps the US, this helps Europe, this helps NATO. It helps us to have a weakened Russia, a country with imperialistic desires and designs that has often worked against us. And it's not just the Ukraine, as I said. We see how they operate in South America, in Nicaragua, Venezuela, as well as Cuba. We see how they operate in Africa, in countries such as Mali, as well as Burkina Faso. We saw how they were operating for years with the Assad regime. So that is some good news that Assad has fled and that's over with. But the fact remains that Russia is a serious influence around the world. And it's a nefarious influence working against us, seeking to destroy us. In the eyes of Vladimir Putin, we're not just in World War III, we're already in World War IV. Chess master Garry Kasparov has said this before. His argument is very simple, is that in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, World War III was the Cold War. Redoing a World War II, massive bombardments and entire fleets fighting with each other, it's just not realistic. It's too costly. He certainly did not anticipate that happening in Ukraine. He really did think it was going to be a 3-day operation. But what is much better is what the Soviets found. The Cold War. Doing it clandestinely, and you know what? It'll never lead to a large-scale war. And we see what Russia does internationally, whether it's assassinations, the poisonings, the sabotage, attempts to blow up civilian airliners. Russia does this, and there's no reaction from the West. So it does seem like the strategy of a Cold War versus a hot war is quite wise. It's a lot cheaper, very effective, and Westerners fear escalation. And so Russia uses that fear against them. And today, they're looking for that same fear. How is it we can manipulate the West to believe that they must give us what we want? And Russia's been so successful so far. So the best thing we can hope for at this point is that those in Washington making the big decisions are able to realize that Russia is treating them as a means to an ends. They're not allies. They have no intention of coming back to the international community and being just one of the guys. Vladimir Putin is a wanted war criminal. He can't even set foot in a great deal of the world's territory. So going ahead, if we want a change for the better, the best thing that we could do is help Ukraine defeat Russia. The downfall of the Putin regime, the end of this incredible enemy of humanity, would be the best thing that can happen to the United States and to Europe. But starting negotiations and telling the Russians we'll give you what they want, we can be very sure this is a recipe for disaster that we will be paying for very, very dearly.